The auditorium smelled of polish and perfume, of hot coffee and paper programs. Light from the high windows poured across rows of folding chairs where families sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching bouquets and phones, rehearsing smiles for the cameras. Caps and gowns pooled like a slow-moving ocean on the stage. Banners announced the graduating class in proud block letters. Today was a small city of joy. He moved through that city like a quiet weather change, present, unavoidable, but often unnoticed. Rafiq's shirt was ironed but faded. His shoes had seen better winters. His palms were creased and calloused, evidence of years carrying chairs, hauling boxes, sweeping classrooms before the campus woke. He kept his head level and his hands folded in his lap like a man at prayer. Rafiq was a peon at the university, a man who kept its daily life possible. He opened gates before sunrise and closed them after sunset. He loaded stacks of curriculum into lecture halls. He cleaned the footprints of dissertations from the stairs. The world that celebrated degrees and dissertations rarely saw him. Students and professors passed him every day. Many didn't know his name, but his son did. His son, Amir, had grown up with the sound of Rafiq's footsteps as a metronome. Amir had learned from a small man who emptied trash bins and hauled furniture that steady work could build a life. Today, Amir would walk across the stage, and that life, theirs, would finally be in the light. Rafiq smoothed the creases in his invitation, as if he could iron dignity into the paper. He found a seat in the family section, somewhere near the middle so the view wouldn't be blocked. Around him, the crowd hummed and laughed. A woman in a silk dress fussed with her phone camera. A grandparent nodded off and woke with a start as a name was called. The principal's voice rolled out, steady and bright. Yet even as the ceremony began, Rafiq felt it. The small, cold gaps in the room, like someone had opened a window. Heads turned. A couple exchanged a look that said, without words, "Why is he sitting there?" The glance that crosses lines between us and them has no sound, but it leaves a bruise. Rafiq kept his gaze forward, to the stage where faces of the graduating students formed a slow constellation. He let his chest swell quietly with the same feeling that had gotten him up before dawn for 30 decades. Pride. He had worked for this day. He had saved. He had denied himself small comforts so Amir could have a desk and books. This seat, this thin program in his pocket, should have been proof enough. The first names were called. Applause burst and settled, came and went. A tide of ordinary celebration. Rafiq clapped, a careful, practiced clap. Not showy, not loud. His hands were not soft, but they knew how to hold a moment. Then footsteps came down the aisle like an announcement. Measured, purposeful, the uniformed click of two men whose job it was to keep order. They stopped at his row. "Sir," one of them said, flat voice under the auditorium's high ceiling, "this section is reserved. You'll have to step outside." The words landed like a stone. Rafiq looked up slowly, unfolded the invitation and held it out. Simple proof of belonging. The paper trembled in his hand. The guard read the card with the same speed a man reads a label on a can, then looked up and walked on. "This is not your place. Please step outside." A sound moved across rows, the subtle intake of breath that means a story has turned. Rafiq's heart tightened. For a man who had kept so much silent his whole life, humiliation can sometimes feel like the loudest thing in the room. He rose, slowly, because years of being overlooked had taught him the safest way to go unnoticed. Stand, step, leave. But the chair scraped the floor, and somewhere, a life that had been saving itself up for this single hour felt like it might shatter.
When humiliation presses near, memory becomes a shelter. Rafiq's mind drifted, not out of avoidance, but because his life had been built of small, stubborn decisions that deserved telling. He remembered the campus gate, the first time he crossed it as a child, a place too bright for his shoes and too full of words he could not yet read. His father had died when Rafiq was young, leaving a hole and a household. By 14, he had a broom in hand and a job list, not a school bag. He swept lecture halls while students discussed poets whose names he slowly learned by listening. He learned the language of calendars and timetables by reading discarded flyers and late-night bus timetables. He learned to listen. He remembered the first time he held Amir's tiny hand. The birth had been a miracle and a concrete promise. He vowed then not to become wealthy, but to buy Amir the single most important thing he could: options. If he could not give the boy a pedigree, he would give him a desk and enough food and the stubborn belief that education was not a luxury but a ladder. To keep that promise, he made small betrayals of hunger. He declined hot tea in the mornings so Amir could have milk. He worked nights to pick up overtime so Amir could have a second-hand textbook that still smelled faintly of coffee. He stood between the boy and the world's discouraging remarks. He taught Amir to write with practice sheets, rescued from the lost and found and tenderness. There were winters when students in jackets joked about the peon who was part of the scenery. Once, a campus security chief told him to sweep a certain corridor more often because the decent people sit there. That phrase lodged in him like a splinter. He learned to carry it silently. But he also learned small triumphs. He learned that Amir's first poem, pinned on a classroom wall, glowed in the light until Rafiq felt as if someone had polished his heart. He learned to read little notes from teachers praising Amir's focus. He cried once in the storeroom beside mobs when a scholarship notice came through, not from pain, but from the relief that, for the first time, saving had turned into opportunity. All of those small victories brought them to this day: Amir in a borrowed gown, Rafiq with a folded invitation in his pocket. The price for that invitation had been a lifetime of trade-offs. Rafiq's bones ached from labor, but the ache was not only fatigue, it was the ache of purpose fulfilled. When the guard's hand brushed his arm that morning, it reawakened scenes from a life he had learned to arrange like beads on a string. The nights he worked until dawn, the time a professor complimented Amir's essay, and Rafiq had come home dizzy with pride. The afternoons he watched his son practice speech after speech, not knowing then that a list of names would one day be called from a stage and include Amir's. This was his hour. He had earned it. He had risked hunger, sleep, embarrassment, and the stubbornness of a man unwilling to let his son's future slip through his fingers. That one chair in the middle of the family section was not a favor. It was a small, just reward. And still, when the guards told him to leave, his body moved the way it had been trained: slow, obedient, almost invisible. He stepped toward the aisle, counting the number of breaths he had left before he would be out the door and away from the view of his son. As his foot found the aisle, anger and shame braided in his chest. He thought about the many times he had hidden his pain, when a shopkeeper passed by as if he were air, when a lecture hall door closed on the sound of his shoes. He had learned not to protest, because loudness often got you punished twice: first by the one who shamed you, then by the world that would call you trouble. But beneath the familiar coil of resignation, a small hope trembled. Someone will notice. Someone will speak. It was not a demand for spectacle. It was a quiet imploring to the universe that the life he had built in the background be recognized in this rare public light. He didn't realize that a dozen and then 6 people would answer.
The taller guard had the kind of face that fit uniforms, angular, practiced in giving orders. The other had a chip on his shoulder, sharpened like a coin. They had walked the aisle like judges. When they stopped at Rafiq's road, their presence filled the space with a certain kind of brittle authority. "Sir, you need to stand," the taller one said. "This seating is for invited guests only." "I am his father," Rafik said, holding his invitation like a passport. "Amir Khan, he's graduating." The guards glanced over the paper without really seeing it, like men who read labels and not stories. "Invitations mean nothing," the shorter one said. "We have orders about crowd control. Step outside. Don't cause a scene." Around them, the city of celebration narrowed into a ring of faces. Curious, uncomfortable, complicit. A woman in the row behind coughed. Two young men exchanged a smirk as if they'd been granted a private entertainment. A toddler started to fidget. His mother shushed him. Someone whispered, "He doesn't look like he belongs." Those words landed, like many others in Rafik's life. The shame, the immediate press of other people's gaze made the room feel smaller. His hands tightened on the program until the paper creased. He fought for a voice that would not vibrate. "I came 8 hours by bus. I worked double shifts to save the fare. My son is on that stage." The guard's eyes slid away, uncomfortable. "We have to keep that section clear," the taller guard said. "You can watch from the lobby." From the stage, the principal was still reading names, oblivious to the small drama forming in the rows. The public is often polite to the point of passivity. We look away because looking can make us responsible. A few people shifted, folded their arms, returned to their programs. Rafik's posture bent with an old, practiced humility. He began to move toward the aisle, intending to leave without a scene. As he stood, the whole sequence of surrender felt familiar. The brief humiliation, the forced exit, the lifelong lesson of belonging denied. But it is a different thing to be pushed out of joy in a room full of witnesses. This time, the crowd's eyes felt heavier. The murmur rose. A hand clutched a bouquet tighter. Someone's camera pointed awkwardly in their direction, the screen a small mirror of judgment. The shorter guard's voice hardened. "Move, now. We don't need trouble." There it was, the hand near the belt, the stance that said the threat was only a slow breath away. Rafik could feel fear, yes, but also a deeper weariness. He looked once toward the stage where Amir stood in line, a small figure in black with a shaking jaw. Rafik's feet paused, a lifetime of decisions narrowed into one: to leave and keep his son's day intact, or to stay and risk becoming the center of a spectacle that would not honor either of them. He took one step toward the aisle. The guards moved to usher him. Their hands were not rough, but they were final. And then, like a sudden change in the weather, a voice said simply and powerfully, "Enough." The hall turned.
They rose not as a mob, but as a small, deliberate council. Each professor's robe swept the floor with the kind of quiet authority earned by long years of scholarship and classroom battles. They did not storm the aisle. They moved like people who had come prepared to be present. First to stand was Dr. Malik Thompson, a scholar of history whose voice carried the cool weight of someone who had taught generations to read the past. Next came Prof. Aisha Coleman, whose work in African American studies had made her both tender and merciless when injustice appeared. Dr. Jerome Wallace, a philosopher who believed words should be measured and used like tools, rose third. Prof. Nina Brooks, a sociologist with a laugh that could disarm and a stare that could challenge assumptions, joined them. Dr. Elijah Carter, who taught constitutional law and had argued cases in small courts, moved with careful precision. Lastly, Prof. Simone Reed, a literature professor who had spent decades translating silence into story, stood and scanned the room. There was no fanfare.
There was only a line of people who had decided in one small motion to refuse to be bystanders. "Who are you to tell him to leave?" Dr. Mullick asked, stepping into the aisle with a measured calm. His voice filled the auditorium like a bell. "He is a father. He is a guest. He is a human." The lead guard straightened. "This is ceremony protocol," he said, trying to reclaim authority. "Protocol is not a cover for prejudice," Prof. Aisha replied. Her face was open, her anger controlled. She had written about dignity for years. Tonight she used those words person to person. "You were asking a man to leave who has given his labor to this institution. Where is the courtesy in asking him to step out?" The shorter guard blinked, as if he'd never been addressed in that register. He tried to speak, but Dr. Jerome's voice caught him in the room in which moral language lives. "It's not enough to follow orders that make the dignity of others disappear. This is a moment of human consequence. Decide which side you're on." The professors began to speak, not with harshness, but with facts and memory, and the kind of moral geometry that rearranges a room. They recounted quietly in clipped sentences the man's years on campus, opening gates, fixing broken chairs, being there in the rain. Dr. Elijah Carter cited a policy the guard had likely not read: family seating should be honored when verified. Prof. Nina Brooks pointed to the faces in the crowd that had shifted from judgment to curiosity and then to shame. As each voice added to the circle, the auditorium felt the tilt of moral gravity. The guards who had the muscle of enforcement realized for the first time that they were being watched by a different authority, that of conscience and of institutionally respected peers. The shorter guard's jaw clenched. He had clearly been trained in commands, not in conversation. Prof. Simone Reed stepped close to Rafiq with the gentleness of someone who understands when a human being is on the verge of collapse. She laid a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Sit," she said, in a tone that had no pity and therefore no arrogance. "You belong here." The lead guard tried to salvage the situation. "We're enforcing rules, and the rule you enforce shouldn't be a weapon to exclude. You don't decide who belongs to this community. We do. And if you cannot hold that responsibility with dignity, then step aside. If you lay hands on this man, you will answer to more than a camera's lens. You will answer to the conscience of this campus." There was a particular silence that follows the correction of power. It is heavy with the understanding that a joke has been exposed as cruel. You could hear breath move in the same way a room inhales before a storm. The guards' shoulders lowered. Their stance changed from command to reconsideration. They had been taught procedures and the quietness of compliance. They had not been taught the particular stubbornness of a room that will not let shame pass. The lead guard muttered something to the effect of, "We'll step back," and the guards retreated a few paces. They did not look at Rafiq. Their exit was an uncomfortable shuffle. The professors, however, did not cheer. They sat down with an economy of motion that signaled not triumph, but restoration. Where the auditorium had minutes before been a collective of private concerns, it now met in a shared public moment. Phones were lowered. Eyes that had earlier judged now lingered with new questions. People were trying to understand what they had almost been complicit in. The 6 professors did not need to boast. Their presence had done the speaking. They had reframed space. Rafiq belonged. Shame did not. Up on the stage, Amir felt something like a premonition. Names blurred into motion. Students reading their names like the recitation of weather, their steps measured, their hands offered. When he noticed his father's chair, the scene was already a different color. From where he stood in the line, he could see Rafiq sitting back down, guided into his place, surrounded by professors who had risen like sentinels. Amir's chest tightened. He'd rehearsed 1,000 different speeches in his head. What to say to scholarship committees, how to thank donors, a joke about exams. He had not rehearsed how his father's presence would land in his body in front of an auditorium. The gesture of that hand on his father's shoulder was a kind of benediction. When his name rang out, the sound hit him like a light. He stepped forward, diploma folder waiting for him like a small, heavy book. As he crossed the stage, he saw faces turned, not just toward him, but toward the man who had gotten him there. The clapping that greeted him was immediate, and instilled by the memory of everything that had happened minutes before. Then something remarkable happened. The 6 professors rose again, not as a show, but as a coordinated, earnest tribute. They raised their hands and clapped in deliberate cadence, not a perfunctory clap, but as if they were giving a salute. 6 hands moved in unison, slow, purposeful. The sound that followed was different from the earlier applause. It was a sound like unanimity, a deep affirmation that included the father's life. Amir accepted his diploma and scanned the crowd until he found his father. Their eyes locked. Rafiq's face was wet up to corners, not with loud sobs, but with small, private flood that comes from something long held suddenly being seen. He nodded once. Not a wave, but a tiny, solemn motion like a promise kept. Later, when the ceremonies wound down and caps were tossed, and the crowd thinned to clusters sharing photographs and goodbyes, Amir made his way down the aisle and into the sunlight where his father waited. They hugged without fanfare. The embrace had the softness of 2 people who had made the same hard bargain and kept it. Amir asked, "You saw me?" Rafiq said, "I always see you." His voice had that rough texture of labor, but it held warmth that washed through Amir. Always. They spoke quietly, exchanging the small things people say that are bigger than words. Later, when reporters and a few of the curious approached, Amir stood taller, not performative, but steadied by the knowledge that his father had been defended by something larger than policy, by conscience incarnate. The professors drifted by in the clearing light like elders who had done what elders must do. Dr. Malik lingered, and in the way of teachers offered Amir a line not for a speech, but for life. Carry this day inside you. Let dignity not only be performed, but practiced. As the sun moved across the parking lot and families loaded trunks, a hush of reflection lingered. People had watched an ordinary celebration become a public lesson. The performance on stage would be recorded and photographed, but what would remain in memory was the small act of justice conferred by people who knew how to use their authority for restoration. Rafiq and Amir walked to the car with slow, careful steps. The world had not been entirely changed that day. Big structures still stood stubbornly in place. But for one man and his son, the arc of a life, from early morning sweeps to a diploma in his son's hands, had been visibly, publicly honored.
Graduation days are measured in diplomas and speeches, in scholarships awarded and photographs taken. But some moments hold another kind of currency, the restoration of dignity, the public correction of a wrong. The memory of the 6 professors, calm, articulate, principled, standing to defend a man who had lived in the university's margins, is the kind of moral instruction that stays with a community longer than any plaque. This story is not about triumphalism. It is about what happens when people who hold institutional respect decide to use it on behalf of the humblest among them. It is about how courage sometimes looks like a quiet refusal to look away, and how leadership sometimes asks not for thunderous words, but for the steady act of standing. Rafiq's life after that day did not become easy overnight. He returned to the same corridors and the same tasks, but he carried with him the evidence that he belonged. Amir walked into a world with a diploma and a new sense of how power could be marshaled for dignity, not humiliation. And the professors, they kept teaching, but they taught differently now because they had practiced what they preached. Justice is not an abstract lecture, it is a lived commitment. If you take anything from this, let it be simple. Belonging is a thing to be defended. Dignity is not earned by conformity, it is recognized by others who choose to see. And sometimes change arrives not as legislation, but as a collected refusal. A handful of people standing up at the right time and making the room remember what it already knew in its better parts. When the light falls across any campus, there are those who sweep the floors and those who read in oak-paneled rooms. Today, the sweeper's quiet labor was made visible. Today,
The archive of small injustices was punctured by moral presence. Today, a boy who had watched his father's back all his life saw that back straightened by more than muscle, by the weight of collective, chosen respect. If this moved you, share it. Tell someone who needs to be reminded that dignity is not given by paper or appointment. It is acknowledged when people with power decide to use it as a bridge, not a barrier.